Welcome to the Unlist. Today, I want to have a short conversation about the brand Zaharoff, a designer house that sort of sits somewhere in a no man's land between typical fashion designers, the niche realm, and some might even say, as of recently, the influencer brand realm. This is because the owner of Zaharoff, one George Zaharoff, began his career doing very low volume men's fashion accessories, including things like business shirts, ties, cufflinks, small leather goods like wallets, belts, things of that nature. This was way back actually in the early to mid 90s, and then he expanded into fragrance in the late 90s, launched a fragrance line under his own name, so there was a Zaharoff and a Zaharoff Puro. After that, he shuttered the fragrance operation and brought it back a handful of times throughout the 2000s and 2010s, until finally relaunching just the fragrance brand effectively by itself in 2018, this time focusing just on men's fragrances, because I guess the other accessories and apparel that Zaharoff had made were focused on men, so it didn't make sense to bring back a woman's fragrance, since the original one, released in the late 90s, I guess wasn't a very big seller for the house. So here's the thing about George Zaharoff and the Zaharoff brand that a lot of you may not realize, and that's the current Zaharoff lineup of fragrances is actually a reconstruction of sorts of the original men's fragrance, which was launched alongside the women's one way back in the late 90s. You see, what effectively happened here is when George Zaharoff made the men's counterpart to the women's Zaharoff fragrance, he patterned it after a scent that he wore himself. One fragrance that you may have heard of called Escada Puro, released in 1993. He was a big fan of Escada, and it was his signature fragrance, but I think at some point in time he decided he wasn't liking the way it wore anymore, or maybe it was a reformulation he didn't care for. So he had the fragrance effectively analyzed by perfumer Claude Deer, who then sort of tinkered around and made a more custom, bespoke version of this fragrance. I haven't smelled either Escada Puro or the original Zaharoff Puro fragrance, but from accounts I've read, it seems like Escada was in line with Safari for Men by Ralph Lauren or Pasha de Cartier. So that, spicy, ambery, semi-oriental fougere kind of fragrance. So I expect the original Zaharoff Puro, according to the note breakdown I've read, to be in that same train of thought, right? Spicy, warm, rich, a little bit of vanilla, da-da-da-da-da. So anyway, that fragrance was originally launched alongside the other Zaharoff apparel that he had at the time. Like I said, business shirts, ties, things like that. And then after a few years, that fragrance was discontinued. And I'm guessing he had a personal stash that he wore, and that's what he carried with into the 2000s, 2010s. Now, I've seen some conflicting reports saying that the original Zaharoff Puro was re-released in 2008, but that would seem kind of a bad move, considering 2008 was also when the financial collapse happened. So I don't know how real that is, but I do know that it did come back one more time in 2014. And this was because a few years prior, 2012, the Zaharoff brand had grown to the point where George was able to actually launch a physical flagship boutique for the brand in Chicago. Those of you who are familiar with the Chicago area might remember the Marilyn Miglin boutique. So that boutique shuttered. Those of you who remember the Marilyn Miglin brand might know it was famous for, on the men's side of things, famous for fragrances like MD Miglin and Pheromone for Men. So Zaharoff basically moved into that boutique in 2012, and from that boutique, that was sort of like the base of operations for the brand's American business. There's also a French address listed for the brand too, which is still around, but I don't know if that's a retail outlet or just an office. The Chicago boutique, though, was the only physical format that Zaharoff had, outside of deals with third-party sellers and licensed resellers, so on and so forth. So that boutique unfortunately no longer exists. I think it shuttered during the pandemic, which makes sense. A lot of luxury boutiques died a sad death after the pandemic made it impossible to, shop at them. So these days, Zaharoff is strictly an online affair. They do have a couple of deals to sell their fragrances in physical format, but these days the number of physical format availability stores for Zaharoff is dwindling. So one of the biggest suppliers of Zaharoff was Nordstrom. And even before the current crop of fragrances, Nordstrom was carrying the fragrance, the leather goods, the shirts and things for Zaharoff through the 90s and 2000s, all the way up until actually just recently. 2022, I believe, is when Zaharoff and Nordstrom finally parted ways. And that's unfortunate because, you know, without having the Zaharoff stuff at the Nordstrom counters to test, it's really kind of impossible, at least in the United States, it's kind of impossible to actually sample this fragrance range unless you're lucky enough to be near the one remaining physical boutique that Zaharoff has a deal with, a place called Dor Paris, or D''OR, a boutique that operates out of Beverly Hills, LA, Los Angeles, California. So if you're lucky enough to live in California and you can walk into the Dor boutique, you can sample the Zaharoff fragrances there. But outside of that, there's no way to physically test these fragrances. You have to literally get samples online. You used to be able to get samples online from Zaharoff directly for free, but unfortunately they don't offer free samples anymore, and the couple times I tried to get free samples using that form, I was completely ignored, which that left a bad taste in my mouth, obviously, because I know other friends of mine who actually got their samples, and whereas I did not. So I'm only even able to make this video because a friend of mine sent me some discovery kits that she had purchased and was done with them and basically passed them along to me. And these discovery kits aren't cheap. They're like $70 a pop. So she basically gave me retail value $140 worth of Zaharoff travel size things to test in order for me to bring this video to you today. So I have to say thank you for that. But the Zaharoff brand, in spite of being kind of, impossible to test, and you have to purchase the samples now from the brand if you want to find out what the brand's about, I do have to say the fragrances themselves are pretty good if, and here's a big if you like that sort of functional, pragmatic sort of fragrance ethos, So we're talking like a Prada where everything is kind of office safe, or like what Jeremy Fragrance tried to do with the Fragrance One range, where he had like a one-stop shop solution of fragrances for, everyone who was trying to not really go down the fragcom rabbit hole. They just wanted a date night fragrance, an office fragrance, So that sort of thing is kind of what the Zaharoff Signature Pour Homme range does. And the cool thing is it does it successfully, whereas I feel like with the Fragrance One range from Jeremy Fragrance, those were too youthful, too bubblegummy, very loud kind of fragrances. Loud like the train going by right now, very loud like that. So they weren't really good for their intended purpose. But the Zaharoff fragrances, on the other hand, actually are very well balanced. They have kind of just the right amount of sillage, just the right amount of projection. You're not going to get in trouble wearing them. People aren't going to go, ugh, like that. But some folks might find that pragmatic approach a bit boring. It just depends on what your interest in wearing fragrance is. So anyway, the current offerings, starting with the original Zaharoff Signature Pour Homme, released in 2018. The general focus is a sort of I want to say soapy, clean, creamy, sort of wet shaving style of fougere. So think Rive Gauche Pour Homme from 2003, think Azzaro Pour Homme from 78, that kind of style. Mixed with a bit more contemporary, fresh notes. So we're talking like a clean patchouli, a very noticeable clean lavender, not that real creamy sort of herbal lavender, but more of that soapy clean sort of, I don't want to say like Yardley's, but kind of like the Yardley's English lavender vibe. So think also like Masculine Pluriel by MFK is another good one that you could kind of put in here. And then of course the base has got a bit of like smoky incense, which doesn't smell like real frankincense to me. It smells more like your Acqua di Gio Profumo style of Norlimbanol fragrance sort of incense vibe. And then also oud is listed, but again, I don't really get any actual oud here. And, you know, if George Zaharoff watches this video and wants to prove me wrong, say, no, this is real oud, and shows me, like, you know, chromatography or whatever, that's cool. I'll stand corrected. But until I have that confirmation, I don't really smell real oud fragrance. Although I do get a little bit of that medicinal, woody aspect that passes for oud in most of your contemporary Western fragrances that claim to have an oud note, like your M7s of the world and your Tom Ford oud woods of the world, so on and so forth. Mostly, though, this is not an oud fragrance, and it's not an incense fragrance. It's just a very complex, soapy, clean, creamy, a little bit spicy, just your very sort of complex, well-rounded, office-friendly fougere kind of fragrance. And Signature Pour Homme itself was a revision of the original Zaharoff Pour Homme, because Zaharoff Pour Homme, the formula was lost. After that last 2014 reissue, there was no more of that fragrance. And the reason is Claude Deer, the perfumer, lost the formula. So George himself had to give a bottle, from what I read, had to give a bottle to Claude Deer to have it analyzed and figure out what was in it, so that way they could kind of build a new fragrance out of the ashes of the old, so to speak. Now, bear in mind, a lot of the information I'm giving you in this video is actually not something that you'll find on the Zaharoff website. It's stuff that you've got to really dig up from old news articles and fashion magazines and fragrance magazines, online stuff. And a lot of it's behind paywalls, so I had to use some clever workarounds to get around these paywalls so I could read this stuff. Like the information about the boutique that was launched in 2012 in Chicago. That's behind the paywall for an old Chicago Tribune, you know, article. So stuff like that is where I'm getting this from, guys. I'm not just making this stuff up. So after the relaunch of the Zaharoff fragrance range with the Signature Pour Homme, the brand then began to create some flankers, and you'll see that with the Royale flanker, the Citrine flanker. They're all in the Signature range, though, the Noir flanker, the Rose flanker. And this is why I make the comparison to Fragrance One, like a superior version of Fragrance One, because all of the flankers have that same DNA of the original Signature, just like all of the Fragrance One flankers, the date, the black tie, all of that, the unisex, they all had traits of the original Office. Same thing here. All of the flankers in the Signature line all have traits of the original Signature. Let's just, with the Royale, it's sweeter, spicier, more fruity. With the Noir, it's darker, smokier, cleaner. With the Citrine, it's more like for gym bag use, it's more fresh. And then, of course, the Rose flanker is going to be more sophisticated, more floral. So the idea is you buy all of these different Zaharoff fragrances and you keep them together as a sort of, you know, Lazy Susan kind of one-stop shop. All of these are together. All of your needs are met. You don't have to go down the rabbit hole. You don't have to become a frag bro. You don't have to watch YouTube. You don't have to go on Instagram, Fragrantica, base notes, none of that. The irony is, though, the recent development from the brand has shifted away from this evergreen, sort of versatile one fragrance or one line of fragrance for all mentality. And recently George Zaharoff has started going towards more of, you know, and I'm going to put this as politely as I can, but more like hype mongering, you know, trying to get hype beast, clicks, trying to get people to sort of join the cult, so to speak, you know, and drink the Kool-Aid. And he's doing this by courting influencers. Now, no disrespect to those guys, because I know some of them, but the whole Zed Creators thing, where he's finding the more prominent YouTubers in the community, the ones who don't already have their own fragrance ranges, you know, because like Red Essence does stuff with Navitus and so on. So he's not going to go after those guys. They've already got ranges. But going after the people who don't really have opportunity to launch their own lines, and sort of courting them, approaching them. And then, of course, that means you've got fragrances coming out from Curly Scents. Justin Copeland has 2 through Zed Creators. Ross has 2. Joey Cannoli recently got a fragrance from. So that's my point. And that marketing direction might not vibe with some people. I'm personally not a fan of the whole hype train thing of jumping on trends. These are all limited, one and done fragrances. So if you don't buy them like the moment they come out, then you miss out. So it kind of creates that whole jumping through hoops to keep up with the Joneses kind of thing. And again, this isn't something that's reflective of the actual influencers. They're just seizing an opportunity, because who doesn't want their own fragrance range, right? If I had an easy way of launching a fragrance range, I probably would too. I just don't want to go down that route because it's a conflict of interest for what I do, with my reviews and all my nonprofit stuff. I'm just here to give you, advice and stuff and my 2 cents on fragrances without trying to sell you something. So it's why I don't really explore that, having my own product range. But if it was something very easy to do and I could do it separately, I probably would. It wouldn't be a part of this channel or anything, but who knows? I wouldn't mind seeing my own custom fragrance, but again, it's something I don't really mess with. So I can't blame them for wanting to jump on the Zed Creators thing. My conflict with that, though, for me personally, and this is no personal hate on George or nothing, my conflict is it kind of sits in contrast to what the brand was trying to be. Prior to the whole Zed Creators thing, the brand was trying to give you this sort of comprehensive range that you could wear in all situations with variations on a theme, But then once you started seeing stuff like the Zed Creators range, and then of course we also got more recent additions to the signature range, like the Tabac, and now we have the leather Tabac, and those fragrances don't feel like they mesh well with the original line that came out in 2018. They feel like they're more trend conscious, for lack of a better word. And again, it's fine. It's not a deal breaker for me. I still like Zaharoff. I still like the range. I still like the fragrances. I just feel like the whole jumping on the hype train thing, getting influencers involved, throwing pizza parties. I've seen recent videos where they all got together and had a pizza party. It just kind of sends mixed signals to me. And it's no hate on nobody. I just don't like the optics of it. I think it's a bit embarrassing, personally. But again, it's no harm, no foul. No hate on those guys. They're having a good time. And ultimately, if no one's being hurt in the process, I have nothing to say. No criticism, no serious criticism. I'm just saying that it looks kind of corny. But no one's being hurt. So if you enjoy those fragrances, if you were able to get your hands on them, then kudos to you. Plus, I guess the one and done aspect of these limited Zed Creator fragrances also kind of harkens back a bit to the Zaharoff legacy. Prior to George Zaharoff having his own house, his mother, Mariana Zaharoff, had a very custom, by commission, bespoke clothing business that she ran. And she'd started this in the 70s. And sort of like a British tailor on Savile Row or German Street, or like, an individual couture boutique on Rive Gauche in Paris, where you don't buy the clothes, they're not sitting on a shelf. It's not ready to wear. It's like bespoke tailoring for you. That was what his mother did. So Mariana Zaharoff made her claim to fame creating clothes for dignitaries, for celebrities, and these were all one-off pieces too. These were all very limited. She did make a couple of things that you could buy. She made small series of garments that would sell in places like the Wearable Art Boutique, which sadly is no longer around. But you could go into places like Wearable Art, and under consignment you would be able to buy limited series pieces that weren't custom from Mariana Zaharoff. And if you see any of those, they typically appear with a tag on the back that says MZ Zaharoff, with like a picture of like a world map on it. So if you want to Google that, you'll see what I'm talking about. World map with MZ Zaharoff. That's George's mother's clothing business. That's her apparel line. And that heritage from doing that kind of is what inspired him to launch his own house to begin with. Difference being that his accessories, his wallets and stuff, they weren't one and done. They weren't limited, bespoke custom creations. They were effectively, they were ready to wear. You could buy them at Nordstrom at one point. Not anymore, but you could buy them at Nordstrom. Now you have to buy them online. So maybe in some ways, the Zed Creators range is actually more in line with what his mother used to do, where these were all very unique, original pieces. You know, like I said, once in a lifetime. Don't buy it. It's gone. Never see it again. Who knows? It's just that's where the business now has headed. And also with the focus of pulling away from Nordstrom distribution, no longer having a physical boutique for the Zaharoff brand, everything basically being online only, it kind of pushes the brand in a direction where I think its long-term viability is kind of put in question. you know, because it's getting harder and harder, like I said, to find these fragrances. Price-wise, though, it's not bad. Like I said in the beginning of the video, we're sitting somewhere between designer and niche and the more influencer. So we're looking at about $135 to $200 for a bottle of fragrance. $135 for the 50 mils, or I think those are 2 ounces, so like 55, 60 mils. I'm not sure what the metric equivalent is, but $135 for the 2 ounce. And if you can find them, they're kind of harder to get, but the 4 ounces are about $195. And not all of them actually come in 4 ounces, by the way. Some of them only come in 2. A lot of the flankers to the original only come in 2. The original comes in 4, the Noir comes in 4, and I think the Tabac also comes in 4, but a lot of them are only coming in 2. And the Z Creators, by the way, those also only come in 2. So in some cases, the $135 to $155 price tag for the 2 ounces is the only way you're going to get some of them. And of course, the Z Creator ones being, you know, one batch only, and a lot of those are discontinued now. They're going to be much more because you have to buy them on eBay, secondhand, and you know where that goes. So that's it, guys. That's the Zaharoff range. The primary line is very versatile, very signature kind of fragrance, as the name suggests, signature pour homme. Nothing for women, though, unfortunately. It's all stuff that's made for men. I think the Curly Scents fragrance is made for women because Curly Scents is a woman, right? So that would make sense. But outside of that particular fragrance, they're all more or less male market oriented, and that's the direction this brand is effectively going in. And it's been the On List. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and have a good day.